All right, mid-segment continued. So we have these figures we're going to be working with a lot, and all of these guys are mid-segments. And so you have to know that this guy is half the length of this guy, isn't he? Which means, since this is the midpoint, it cuts this guy in half. So this length is equal to these two lengths. Does that make sense? The mid-segment's equal to half of the third side. Well, this midpoint cuts this third side in half, doesn't it? And of course, this guy is equal to these two guys. Because this is a mid-segment, it's equal to half of the length, and each of these are a half of the length. Does that make sense? And of course, 1, 2, 3 is equal to... We will work with these figures quite a bit, so you need to get used to seeing those. Does everybody understand all the marks I made on there? All right, good. So let's go on. Now we want to prove, we're going to actually prove that a mid-segment is parallel to the third side. We're going to prove that a mid-segment is half the length of the third side. We talk about theorems a lot in here. Remember, a theorem is something we can prove. So one theorem we can say is that a mid-segment is half the length of the third side of a triangle. A mid-segment is parallel to the third side of a triangle, and we can prove it right here. So first thing we got to do is prove that DE is the mid-segment of triangle ABC. We do that by using the midpoint formula. We're going to use the midpoint formula to find D and E. So if you remember the midpoint formula, I'm going to call it MP, is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, simply the average of the x's and the average of the y's. That's the midpoint formula. All right? We're going to use it to find out that D is the midpoint of AC, and we're going to use it to find out that E is the midpoint of BC, proving that DC is a mid-segment. Okay? So here we go. First to find D. Let's do it right here. D equals, so we'll call this x1 and x2. Now C is at the origin, isn't it? So you should know that that's 0, 0. So it's going to be 4 plus 0 divided by 2. And then the y values, 6 plus 0 divided by 2. That will give us the y value of D. Okay? And why don't we go ahead and put D over here. We'll put D is equal to 4 divided by 2 is 2. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. And we could have just done that by investigation, couldn't we? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Everybody good with D being at 2, 3? And that proves it's the midpoint of AC. All right, let's find E now. So E should be 6 plus 0 over 2. Oops. And 0 plus 0 over 2. Which means E should be at 6 plus 0 is 6, divided by 2 is 3, and 0 plus 0 over 2 is 0. So E is at 3, 0. All right, do you guys all see that we now proved that D is the midpoint of AC and that E is the midpoint of BC? Yeah? Okay. So far, so good. We know that DE is the mid-segment. Now we're going to prove that DE is parallel to AB. That's the first thing we said, is that DE is parallel to AB if it's a mid-segment, right? How do we prove lines are parallel? One of my Math 1 students better come up with this.
Go ahead. You're one of the Math 1s.
How do we know that lines are parallel? They have the same... I'm sorry, I spoke over somebody. They never cross. That's the definition of a parallel lines. They will never cross. That means they have to have the same slope. That's right. So remember the slope formula. Slope formula is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. I like to say delta y over delta x. Delta in math means difference. So the difference in y's over the difference in x's. All right, so let's find the slope of DE first. So we're going to find the slope of DE, which is, here's DE, so it is simply 3 minus 0 over 2 minus 3, which equals 3 minus 0 is 3, 2 minus 3 is negative 1, so we can say the slope of DE is just negative 3. Am I going too fast? Let me scoot that up a bit. Is everybody good with the slope of DE being negative 3? Okay, so if our first statement about midsegments are true, when we find the slope of AB, we're expecting it to be negative 3, aren't we? Because then the same slope proves that they're parallel. So let's find the slope of AB. Remember, the slope formula is delta y over delta x, or y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So it's going to be 6 minus 0 over 4 minus 6, which is 6 over negative 2, which means that the measure of AB equals negative 3. Okay, so we have the measure of AB equals negative 3, and we have the measure of DE equals negative 3. So we just proved the two line segments are parallel, correct? So that proved the first statement, that the midsegment is parallel to the third side. Now we want to prove the second statement, which is the midsegment is equal to half the length of the third side. We're going to use the distance formula to do that. You guys remember the distance formula?
Nope.
You better. Distance formula equals the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. It seems complicated. You're going to have to memorize it because we use it a lot this unit, but it's pretty easy when you got all the information there. First, let's find the length of DE. We've been doing DE first. Too fast? All right, so remember, when we say length of DE, we just write DE with no line over it. This says length of DE equals, okay, we'll write the distance formula, x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And now we'll plug in the info. Okay, here's our DE right here. So we'll go 3 minus 2 squared plus 0 minus 3 squared. Does everybody follow how I got that information plugged in there? The square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Simplifying this guy is not that big a deal. Getting it plugged in is the hard part. It's the square root of 3 minus 2 is 1 squared plus 0 minus 3 is negative 3 squared. The nice thing is we end up with DE equals the square root of 1 plus 9. Okay, so let's go over here and write this down here. DE, the length of DE equals the square root of 10. And we're just going to leave it like that for right now. Okay, now let's find the length of AB. We're expecting the length of AB to be twice as long, right? So let's plug it in. Remember, AB with nothing over the top means the length of AB equals the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Let's plug it in now. Okay, right here, 6 minus 4 squared plus 0 minus 6 squared. All right, so AB equals the square root of 6 minus 4 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. 0 minus 6 is negative 6, and negative 6 squared is 36. So AB equals the square root of 40. All right, so now we got to go back a few weeks. 40 is actually 2 times 2 times 10, isn't it? So in square root purposes, this 2 is going to get out, this 2 is going to get killed, and this 10 stays inside, doesn't it? Bart, you with me? Remember, the square root of 40, it takes, well, the square root of anything, it takes 2 to get 1 out of prison, right? So it takes 2 2's to get 1 out. So this guy got out, he got killed, the 10's going to stay in. And what we end up with is AB equals 2 root 10. And we can see that obviously this guy is twice as long as that guy, right? So this right here proves that DE is half the length of AB. This right here proves that DE is parallel to AB. And we just proved the 2 theorems about a midsegment. Good enough? Too fast? All right, we're going to get lots of practice. Turn the page over. All right. And here's 6 type of questions you're going to see on the units and the unit test. All right, so let's do this together. Always fill out your diagram. L, M, N are midpoints of triangle PQR. So that means that these guys are all 3 mid-segments, right? PR is 46. Now, one way to write this is to go like this. That's one way to show that PR is equal to 46. But since we know that N is the midpoint, couldn't we just write it like this, 23 and 23? Because if N's the midpoint, it cuts 46 in half, 23, 23. Right? Are you with me? Has your brains come to a screeching halt, or are you guys still with me? Your brain's seized up. I see smoke coming out of some of your ears. All right, what else do we know? We know that PQ is 40. Well, here's PQ. L is the midpoint, so it must be 20 and 20, correct? And finally, we know that LN right here is 17. All right. Now, let's talk about the other parts. Since PR is 46, we know that LM is a midsegment, right? So LM must be half the length of PR. So we know that LM is 23. Same thing over here. We know MN is a midsegment, so it has to be parallel and half the length of PQ. Well, half the length of PQ is 20. Okay. And finally, if ln is 17, we know that QR is 34. So I'll go like this. We also know that QM is 17, don't we? And we know that MR is 17. So, even though we were only given 3 lengths, we were able to find every length on that triangle. So good? Are we doing okay? You with me? All right, let's go on to number 2 over here. All right, let's see what we know. Always put your information on your diagram. So we know that BE, find BE, which is right here. We're looking for BE. If we know that CB, which they gave us a little more room, I'm going to turn it. If CB is 11x minus 25, so we know that CB is 11x minus 25, and we know that CE is 4x plus 1. So we know E is the midpoint, right? So let me turn it so you guys can see it. It's kind of... So if CE is the midpoint, we know that CE is 4x plus 1, but don't we also know that EB is 4x plus 1? And CB is 11x plus minus 25, right? So what you guys should realize, hopefully, is that BC equals 2 times EC. If we double EC, it'll equal BC, correct? So let's put in what we know. We know BC is 11x minus 25. And we know EC is 4x plus 1. So now we've got a pretty simple algebra problem there. This means 11x minus 25 equals 2 times 4x is 8x, and 2 times 1 is 2. So now I'll subtract 8x from both sides. I get 3x minus 25 equals 2. I'll add 25 to both sides. I get 3x equals 27. Divide both sides by 3, and I get x equals 9. Okay. Well, we should know that CE is 4x plus 1, but that should also tell us that EB is 4x plus 1. So if we plug in 9, we get 4 times 9 plus 1, which means EB equals 37. Easy peasy, right? Yeah? Okay. All right. So I want to save some time so we can go over your tests. So I want to go over the rest of these real quick. So instead of solving them all the way out, let's just set up the equations. Would everybody be okay with that?
No.
Well, we can finish them. We just may not get to your tests. All right. What do we know about RT and PQ? They're parallel, and we know that PQ is half the length of RT, right? So if we double PQ or go 2 times PQ, it should equal RT, correct? Is everybody following that? So now we just need to plug in the expressions. 2 times 15x minus 7 equals 22x minus 6. And then you guys should be able to solve for x and then plug it back in to find RT. Let's see, 30, 22, 8x. Oh no, yeah, 30, 14, 8. I believe x equals 1, so I'm not positive, but I think x should equal 22 minus 6 would be 16. Not positive on that. Don't quote me, but I think that's it real quick in my head. All right, let's move over to, if you guys are good with this one. Oops, sorry, cut that off a little bit. Are you guys okay with this guy right here? You got to give me a little help here, guys. Some nods, yes or no's. Okay, let's move over to this guy. So let's take a look at the information. We know that MN, right here, NO, and OM, or MO, are mid-segments. So we know each of these guys are half the length of their parallel side. Find the perimeter of triangle JKL. Well, we know the perimeter, we simply add up the three sides, right? So if we went JK and we found KL and we found LJ and we added those three together, we'd get the perimeter, wouldn't we? So let's see what we know. Do we know the length of JK? Anybody?
Yeah.
What is it? Yeah, this is, M is the midpoint, so if this is 42, this is 42, which means JK is 84, isn't it? All right, let's look at KL. Well, KL is going to take some math, isn't it? But let's see. We know that KL is 13x minus 10, and we know it equals two of these guys, right? So we could go 2 times 6x minus 1. Does everybody understand how I came up with that equation? We know that this guy is equal to two of these guys. So real quick, 2 times 6x is 12x. We subtract 12x from both sides, we get x over here. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. If we add 10 to both sides, we end up with x equaling 8. And 13 times 8 is 104. 104 minus 10 is 94. So we know this guy is 94. And do we know the length of LJ? What is it? Yeah, we know that this guy is 49, so it's got to be 2 times 49, or 98. And I didn't leave enough room. What is that? 8 and 8 is 16. Carry the 1. That's 27. So the perimeter is 276. So we actually ended up doing that one. All right, we're just going to do this last one over here, if that's okay with everybody. All right, so look at what we got here. What do we know about mid-segments? What's the first thing we learned? They're parallel. So let's put that down because that might be important here. All right, so who can help me find any of these angles? A really easy one might be to find angle B. B is 127?
Oh, no.
What is it? 53? How do you know B is 53? Yeah, because we know that these two have to be a linear pair, right? 127 plus 53 is 180. These two are a linear pair. Does that help us find anything else? Let me help you out with this. Can we find A? Okay, how can we find E? That would be with these two lines, and these two lines are not parallel, but you got the right idea. Look at, let's go with B and A. What do we know B and A are? They're congruent. How do we know? Say it loud. Corresponding angles are congruent. You have parallel lines that are cut by a transversal. These are corresponding angles, which means A has to be 53 as well. How about angle D? It's got to be 52, right? Corresponding angles. All right, now that we know that B and D are 52 and 53, they add up to 105, don't they? So what does that mean C's got to be if we look at this small triangle? C is 75 because these three angles have got to add up to 180. And the only one that's left is E, which has got to be a linear pair with D, which means 128, right? Easy peasy? Guys, this is what I love about geometry. It's just a puzzle. Don't you guys like doing puzzles?
No. Not puzzles.
Come on, puzzles are fun. All right, so your job tonight for homework is 4.1b.
4.1.
4.1b.